Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to join us for another unforgettable journey through time with the Dawn of Athenian Glory, a tale of rise, ambition, downfall, and rebirth. Discover how Athens, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, shaped the course of history and left an indelible mark on the world. Don't miss this opportunity to explore the triumphs and lessons of Athens, a city that continues to inspire us all. Take your seat and let the story unfold. The sun hung low over the city of Athens, casting long shadows across the ancient stone buildings. The day was waning, but the streets remained busy, filled with merchants, scholars, soldiers, and citizens going about their lives. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the sounds of children laughing as they played in the dust of the agora. In the heart of the city, near the foot of the Acropolis, stood the grand temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. The marble columns towered high into the sky, a testament to the power and prosperity of the city. Athens, though small in comparison to the mighty empires of Persia and Sparta, was a beacon of intellectual and artistic achievement, a city that prided itself on the pursuit of knowledge, beauty, and democracy. In the city's council chambers, the Democratic Assembly was in session. Voices rose in heated debate as citizens argued over the future of their city-state. At the center of the room sat an older man, his face lined with the wisdom of many years. His name was Pericles, and he had come to be known as the philosopher king of Athens. Pericles was not a monarch by birth, but he was a ruler by virtue of his intellect and vision. Under his leadership, Athens had grown in influence, wealth, and power, and it was his dream to make Athens the most enlightened and prosperous city in all of Greece. But Athens was not without its enemies. The Persian Empire, with its vast armies and wealth, threatened the Greek city-states from the east. Sparta, a militaristic and highly disciplined city-state, had always viewed Athens with suspicion and disdain. And within Athens itself, there were factions that opposed Pericles' vision, fearing that his democratic ideals would weaken the city's military strength and leave it vulnerable to external threats. As the debate raged on in the council, a young man named Alcibiades stood up. He was a striking figure, tall and handsome, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to burn with ambition. Alcibiades had recently returned to Athens after spending several years in exile, and he had quickly risen to prominence due to his eloquent speeches and military acumen. Some viewed him as a potential rival to Pericles, while others saw him as a necessary ally in the fight against Athens' enemies. "My fellow Athenians," Alcibiades began, his voice calm and measured, "we stand at a crossroads. The Persian Empire grows stronger by the day, and our allies in the Peloponnesian League grow ever more hostile. Yet here we are, debating the future of a city that has given birth to philosophy, art, and democracy. We must act, and we must act swiftly." Pericles watched him intently, his expression unreadable. Alcibiades had a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, a man whose loyalty could be as fickle as the winds. He was a man of great potential, but also of great danger. "We cannot let fear guide our decisions," Pericles replied, his voice firm but not without kindness. "Athens has always been a city of ideals. We must not sacrifice our principles for the sake of military strength. We must seek a path that ensures our survival without compromising who we are." Alcibiades sneered slightly, his gaze flickering with irritation. "Principles are all well and good, Pericles, but principles do not win wars. What we need is a strong army and an even stronger navy. We need to conquer, not debate." The tension in the room was palpable. The assembly murmured with uncertainty. It was clear that the future of Athens hung in the balance, and the choices made in this chamber would shape the city for generations to come. Pericles stood, his tall form casting a long shadow in the dimly lit chamber. "Alcibiades," he said, quietly, "you are young, and your ambition blinds you. But ambition alone cannot sustain a city. Athens must remain true to its values, or it will lose its soul." Alcibiades' eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed as though he might challenge Pericles directly. But instead, he nodded curtly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We shall see, Pericles, we shall see." The assembly broke into discussions once more, but the seeds of discord had been planted. Alcibiades had made his intentions known, and Pericles knew that the political landscape of Athens was about to change. The city's future was uncertain, and the struggle for power had only just begun. As the council session came to an end, Pericles walked alone through the agora, his mind racing with the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. He had always believed in the power of wisdom and democracy, but now he wondered if those ideals would be enough to secure Athens' survival. The threat from Persia was real, and the growing tension with Sparta could lead to war at any moment. In the distance, the towering figure of the Acropolis loomed over the city, a reminder of Athens' glorious past. But Pericles knew that the city's future would depend not only on its past glory, but on its ability to adapt to the changing times. The stage was set for a struggle that would test the very heart of Athens. The coming days were filled with tension, as Alcibiades' rhetoric continued to stir the hearts of the citizens. His impassioned speeches, filled with promises of military glory and an empire built on conquest, were well received by many, especially the young men of Athens who longed for adventure and fame. Yet Pericles remained steadfast in his vision of a democratic Athens, one that balanced intellect with strength, diplomacy with might. The days stretched on, and the city of Athens simmered with growing unrest. Alcibiades, ever the provocateur, filled the agora with fiery speeches that painted Pericles as a weak ruler, one who prioritized philosophy over action. "Why should we sit idle and debate while our enemies grow stronger?" he would ask the crowds, his voice commanding attention. "Why should we cling to the idea that we can conquer hearts and minds rather than empires and lands?" Many of the youth rallied behind Alcibiades, their desire for glory and power palpable in their eyes. His words struck a chord with those who saw Athens not as a city of ideals, but as a city of action. Alcibiades' magnetic presence and military victories on the battlefield had earned him respect, and his message of dominance seemed to promise a future of greatness. On the other hand, Pericles had grown increasingly concerned. His belief in Athens, intellectual strength in its power to inspire through ideas rather than arms, was being overshadowed by the allure of Alcibiades' promise of glory. But Pericles also knew that war with Sparta was coming. The alliances between Athens and its neighboring city-states were strained, and the threat of Persian conquest loomed over the horizon. Late one evening, as Pericles sat alone in his study, his mind weighed heavy with the burden of his choices. The walls of his chamber, adorned with scrolls of wisdom and paintings of Athens' past victories, seemed to close in on him. His hand rested on the scroll before him, but his mind was not on the words written there. Instead, he was consumed by the conflict within his city and the growing shadows of war that stretched far beyond its walls. He was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was his trusted advisor, Socrates, the philosopher who had become a confidant and a voice of reason in these tumultuous times. "Pericles," Socrates began, entering the room, "I see the weight on your shoulders. The city is on the edge, and you are torn between two paths." Pericles nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I fear, Socrates, that I have led Athens down a road of uncertainty. Alcibiades is stirring the passions of the people, and his vision of conquest has taken root. How can I, a man of reason, combat such fervor? How can I convince a city driven by ambition that our strength lies not in empire, but in the spirit of democracy and enlightenment?" Socrates leaned against the stone wall, his face thoughtful. Pericles, it is not ambition that we must fear, but the loss of our soul. War will come, of course, but Athens must not fight for glory alone. We fight for a vision of a world where ideas, not swords, define our legacy. Pericles looked up at Socrates, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. And how do we protect that vision, Socrates? How do we make Athens a beacon in a world so determined to destroy it? Socrates smiled, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. By showing the people that their true power lies in what they can create, not in what they can destroy. The battle for Athens' soul is not one of armies, but of minds. The philosopher's words struck a deep chord within Pericles. He had long known that Athens' greatness came from its people, its scholars, its artists, its thinkers, and not just from its military might. Yet, as war with Persia loomed on the horizon, it seemed that this vision was slipping away, replaced by the siren call of conquest. In the coming weeks, Pericles sought to counter Alcibiades' growing influence. He called upon the leaders of Athens, great intellectual and cultural circles, urging them to speak out and remind the people of the city's founding principles. He arranged public debates and forums where scholars and philosophers could discuss Athens' role in the world, emphasizing the value of diplomacy, knowledge, and cultural exchange over territorial expansion. But Alcibiades was relentless. His speeches in the Agora became more impassioned, more violent in their tone. He spoke of the glory of a unified Greek empire, one that would rival even the Persian king's power. Athens must become the spearhead of Greece, he declared one afternoon, his voice echoing through the Agora. We must lead all of Hellas into battle against Persia, not just defend our borders. We are a people of warriors, and we must act as such. The crowd erupted in applause, their faces alight with excitement. Alcibiades' vision was seductive an empire of Greek city-states, united under Athens' banner, marching to glory against their ancient enemies. Yet not all were swayed by his words. Some within the city, particularly the older generation, looked at Alcibiades with suspicion. They remembered the power of Pericles' rule, the prosperity Athens had enjoyed under his leadership. It was clear to them that the strength of Athens lay not in the conquest of lands, but in the preservation of its unique identity as a beacon of democracy and culture. One of the most vocal opponents of Alcibiades was Themistocles, a general and statesman who had fought alongside Pericles in the wars against Persia. Themistocles understood the importance of military might, but he also believed that Athens' power came from its alliances and its ability to persuade, not to conquer by force. In a public forum, Themistocles stood before the assembly and spoke, with the calm authority of a seasoned general. We have fought against Persia, not for land, but for freedom. If we are to remain true to our ideals, we must not become the very thing we fought against. Conquest for its own sake leads to destruction, not glory. Alcibiades, hearing Themistocles' words, responded with a fierce retort. Themistocles speaks of freedom, but freedom without power is nothing. What is the use of democracy if we are not strong enough to defend it? What is the use of philosophy if our enemies are at our gates? The two men, representing opposing visions for Athens, were on a collision course. Pericles watched from the sidelines, knowing that the path forward was becoming increasingly unclear. He could not afford to allow Athens to fall into the hands of one man, no matter how charismatic or persuasive he might be. But he also knew that the people of Athens were divided, and that their fate hung on the choices they made in the coming months. As Pericles stood at the heart of the city, looking up at the Acropolis that had once been a symbol of Athenian unity and power, he knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The war for Athens' future was not just a political struggle, it was a philosophical one. Would Athens remain true to its founding principles, Or would it be swept away by the tide of conquest and ambition? Athens was a city of contrasts, its bustling marketplaces full of life, while its political landscape was a cauldron of simmering tension. Pericles, though determined to hold Athens to its democratic ideals, found himself at the center of an increasingly volatile political situation. Alcibiades' growing influence among the people, fueled by his promises of military glory and expansion, threatened to upend everything Pericles had worked for. And beyond the borders of the city, the shadow of war loomed ever larger. The alliance between Sparta and Persia was rapidly becoming a reality. Though the two powers had once been bitter enemies, the threat of a united Greek force under Athens had driven them into an uneasy pact. Sparta, the militaristic powerhouse of Greece, and Persia, the vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to India, seemed an unlikely pair. Yet their shared goal of dismantling Athens' growing influence made them formidable allies. In the midst of these escalating tensions, Pericles called upon his trusted generals and advisors for counsel. The situation was dire. Athens had no choice but to prepare for war. But how would the city respond? Would it be the Athens of old, the beacon of democracy and philosophy? Or would it embrace the vision of Alcibiades and seek military domination? One evening, as the stars twinkled over the city, Pericles stood alone on the steps of the Acropolis, gazing out over Athens. The wind carried the sounds of distant waves crashing against the shore, and for a brief moment he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This city, this idea, was his legacy. But was it enough to save Athens from the forces that sought to tear it apart? Socrates approached, his sandals making soft sounds on the marble steps. He too gazed out at the city, but his eyes were filled not with concern, but with an unusual calm. "The winds are changing, Pericles," Socrates said softly, "and soon they will carry us into the storm." Pericles turned to his friend, his expression grim. "The storm is upon us, Socrates. The alliance between Persia and Sparta threatens everything we have built. If Athens is to survive, we must change our strategies, our alliances, and perhaps even our very ideals." Socrates smiled, a slight curve to his lips. "Perhaps, but know this, the city's greatest strength has always been its ability to think, to reason. War is inevitable, yes, but the way we fight, it must remain true to what we are. If Athens loses its soul in pursuit of victory, then the war will be lost long before the first spear is thrown." Pericles nodded, appreciating the depth of Socrates' words. "I will not let Athens fall into the hands of ambition alone. But what other options do we have?" Socrates gazed at the city, his eyes deep with thought. "The answer, my friend, lies in uniting the people, not through fear, but through reason. We must make them understand that the true strength of Athens lies not in its armies, but in its capacity to inspire, to unite people around a common vision of justice, democracy, and truth." Pericles looked out once more at the city, knowing that Socrates was right, but the path ahead would not be easy. As the days passed, the reality of war became more certain. The leaders of Athens met in secret, discussing their strategies for the coming conflict. Alcibiades, ever the fiery and ambitious leader, had already begun assembling a fleet of ships. His vision was clear. Athens would sail to victory by dominating the seas, defeating Persia and Sparta in one bold stroke. But Pericles, cautious and measured, believed that Athens' true strength lay in its ability to outsmart its enemies, not outfight them. He knew that the city's wealth and influence had always been its greatest assets, not raw military power. The city's fleet was powerful, yes, but so was the might of Sparta on land. And the Persians, with their vast resources, would not be easily defeated. Pericles and Alcibiades, though they both sought the same goal, to preserve Athens, found themselves increasingly at odds. The young general's impatience and desire for quick action clashed with Pericles' belief in the power of diplomacy and thoughtful strategy. As Athens prepared for war, it became clear that the city was at a crossroads. Would it remain true to its values, or would it embrace the militaristic path that Alcibiades envisioned? Days turned into weeks, and soon the winds of war began to blow across the Mediterranean. The ships of Athens were outfitted with new sails, their decks ready for battle. The citizens of the city were called upon to serve those with the wealth to buy armor, those with the strength to fight. The streets buzzed with preparations, the once lively marketplaces now filled with soldiers and craftsmen. But beneath the surface of this apparent unity, the city was divided. Alcibiades' supporters grew bolder, their voices louder, while Pericles' advocates worked tirelessly to keep Athens true to its democratic ideals. As Athens prepared to set sail, Pericles stood before the assembly, his voice steady and resolute. Athens must not become a city of warlords and conquerors. We must fight to protect our city, our culture, and our values. But let us not lose sight of what makes us great. We are the city of wisdom, of reason, of democracy. We must fight, yes, but we must fight on our own terms, not on the terms of those who seek to destroy us. The crowd listened in silence, the weight of Pericles' words settling over them. They knew that war was inevitable, but Pericles had made it clear that Athens' soul must remain intact. As the people filed out of the assembly, there was a sense of both fear and determination in the air. They knew that the coming conflict would determine not just the future of Athens, but the future of Greece itself. The preparations for war continued, and the tension between Athens and its enemies grew ever more palpable. The Spartan and Persian alliance, though still in its early stages, promised to be a formidable force. Sparta, the master of land warfare, and Persia, the empire with limitless resources, would join forces against Athens in what promised to be the greatest conflict the city had ever faced. Alcibiades, ever the ambitious and charismatic leader, continued to rally support for a naval campaign that he believed would strike a decisive blow against the Persian Empire. With the blessing of many in the assembly, Alcibiades set sail with his fleet, eager to prove his vision was the key to Athens' survival. Pericles, however, chose a more cautious path. He knew that Athens could not afford to fight on all fronts at once, and so he focused his efforts on strengthening the city's defenses and forging new alliances. He sent diplomats to the other Greek city-states, attempting to rally support for Athens' cause and ensure that the city would not stand alone in the face of its enemies. As the tension reached its peak, an unexpected twist came when word arrived that the Persians had launched an assault on the Greek islands. This unexpected attack put Athens in a difficult position, forcing Pericles to make a difficult decision. The morning sky over Athens was a wash of orange and pink as the city's inhabitants stirred from their rest. The air was thick with the scent of salt water as the Mediterranean Sea rolled in with a steady rhythm, indifferent to the turmoil brewing just beyond the city's gates. On the edge of the city, the great Athenian fleet, mighty in its design, sleek and strong, was preparing to set sail. Word had come through the channels of Athens' spies. The Persian Empire had launched a surprise assault on the Greek islands, threatening to take control of vital trade routes and disrupt the peace of the region. The assault, though swift, was not unexpected. The alliance between Persia and Sparta was now firmly in place, and the two enemies had synchronized their efforts to cripple Athens' maritime strength. The Greek islands, many of which relied on Athens for protection, were vulnerable, and though Athens had long dominated the seas, the combined might of Persia's immense resources and Sparta's military discipline presented a new challenge. Pericles stood on the dock, his eyes fixed on the fleet. He had never wanted war, but now it was unavoidable. The city had to defend itself, not only from external enemies, but from the growing internal division that threatened to tear Athens apart. Alcibiades, ever ambitious, had already set sail to engage the enemy, hoping to strike quickly and decisively. But Pericles, though he respected Alcibiades' talents, knew that rashness could be just as dangerous as hesitation. Pericles. A voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see his trusted advisor Themistocles approach. Themistocles was a seasoned general, and his calm demeanor had been a source of stability throughout the city's preparation for battle. The fleet is ready. Alcibiades is eager to engage, but I fear his impatience may cloud his judgment. Pericles nodded. I know, Themistocles. He seeks glory, and in doing so, risks everything. But we must not let personal ambition cloud our strategy. We need to fight with wisdom, not passion. Themistocles studied the horizon, his expression unreadable. The Persians are advancing quickly, and their fleet is strong. But we must remember that Athens' strength lies not only in the size of its forces, but in its ability to outthink the enemy. We must strike with precision, not force. Pericles' gaze lingered on the ocean, where Alcibiades' ships were already leaving the dock. The young general, filled with fiery enthusiasm, had always sought to prove himself in battle. And though his heart burned with a desire for victory, Pericles knew that the key to their success lay in strategy, not in rushing headlong into battle. A cold wind swept across the dock, and Pericles felt the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The city was on the brink of war, and though Athens had always been a city of thought, it would now have to fight not just for survival, but for the very soul of Greece. The days that followed were filled with tension. Alcibiades' fleet sailed toward the Greek islands, and Pericles, ever the strategist, kept his distance, focusing on the defense of Athens itself. His orders were clear. Prepare for the worst, but do not act impulsively. The Athenians had learned from their past mistakes. Wars of conquest had always brought the city to the brink of destruction. This time, Athens would fight on its terms. But Alcibiades had no such patience. With his fleet, he engaged the Persian forces off the coast of the island of Delos. It was a bold move Alcibiades intended to strike swiftly, catching the Persians off guard, and perhaps securing a decisive victory. His ships, sleek and fast, were built for this very type of battle. But as the first engagement commenced, it became clear that the Persians had been preparing for this moment as well. The battle was fierce. Alcibiades, commanding his ships from the front, drove his forces forward with all the zeal of a man desperate to prove himself. The battle raged. For hours, the sound of crashing waves mixing with the screams of sailors and the clash of metal. But despite the advantage of speed and maneuverability, Alcibiades' fleet found itself increasingly surrounded by the Persian forces. The Persian navy, bolstered by their alliance with Sparta, had proven more formidable than expected. Their ships were larger, their tactics more disciplined. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the tides of battle shifted. Alcibiades, driven by his desire for victory, refused to retreat. He urged his ships onward, but the odds were beginning to stack against him. The Persians, supported by their Spartan allies, had surrounded the Athenian fleet. The battle was slipping from Alcibiades' grasp. Back in Athens, Pericles received word of the engagement. His heart sank as he read the reports. Though Alcibiades had not yet been defeated, the tide of the battle was turning. The fleet was outnumbered, and the youthful general was fighting with a recklessness that could cost them everything. Pericles had only one choice. He ordered his fleet to sail immediately, preparing for a counteroffensive. Themistocles, his trusted general, would lead the charge. Pericles knew that Athens' survival depended on this battle. They could not afford to lose the islands. If the Persians were allowed to establish dominance over the seas, Athens would be left isolated, vulnerable to further attacks. The Athenian fleet sailed through the night, the moonlight glinting off the polished wood of the ships. As they neared Delos, Pericles stood at the helm of his ship, his thoughts focused on the task ahead. He knew the importance of this moment. If they could turn the tide of the battle, Athens would have a fighting chance. If not, the city would fall, its ideals and its people crushed beneath the weight of empire. The sounds of the battle reached them before they saw the first ship in the distance. The air was thick with smoke, and the sea churned with the wreckage of broken ships. The Athenians, now joined by Pericles' fleet, raced toward the island, their sails catching the wind like a rush of life. As they drew closer, Pericles could see the chaos of the battle. The Persian ships, though massive, were disorganized. Alcibiades' forces had managed to hold them off, but they were badly damaged. The tide was turning. With a cry of determination, Pericles' fleet surged forward, joining the fray. The battle between the Persians and the Athenians raged for hours more, but now it was clear. The Athenians had the upper hand. Pericles' fleet, disciplined and precise, cut through the Persian forces like a knife through butter. The Spartan ally ships were scattered, retreating under the pressure of the combined Athenian forces. Finally, as the sun began to rise on the second day of battle, the Persians, overwhelmed and broken, began to retreat. Alcibiades, bloodied but victorious, stood at the prow of his ship, his face lit with the thrill of victory. "We did it!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the waters. But as he looked around at the wreckage of the battle, he knew that this was only a small victory in a much larger war. Pericles, watching from his ship, allowed himself a moment of relief. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Persian threat was still very much alive, and Sparta's growing resentment of Athens would soon require more than naval engagements. The Battle of Delos had been won, but the real test for Athens was yet to come. Pericles knew that the path forward would require not just military prowess, but the strength of Athens' ideals. Could the city hold true to its vision of democracy and wisdom in the face of such overwhelming opposition? As the fleet sailed back to Athens, the citizens gathered along the shores to celebrate the hard-won victory. But deep within the heart of the city, Pericles knew that the battle for Athens' soul was far from over. The sun hung low over the Athenian horizon, casting a golden hue on the marble buildings that had withstood centuries of wind and rain. The celebrations that followed the victory at Delos were grand, with songs and dances filling the streets. Athenians reveled in their success, proud of their fleet and their valor on the waves. Yet amid the jubilation, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the battle for Athens was far from over. Pericles stood in the agora, watching the crowd, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The victory had been necessary, but it had come at a cost. Alcibiades, for all his passion and military genius, had proven unpredictable, and the political landscape of Athens had become more divided than ever. The once strong unity of the city was now strained under the weight of ambition, conflicting visions, and the ever-present threat of war. The young general, Alcibiades, had returned to Athens, hailed as a hero. But Pericles could not shake the feeling that Alcibiades' ambitions went far beyond the military victories he had won. He was more than just a commander. He was a force that threatened to rewrite the future of Athens itself. And with his ever-growing influence over the people, the question was no longer if Alcibiades would challenge Pericles' leadership, but when. Socrates, ever the philosopher, had remained an observer, but his calm demeanor had been replaced with an edge of concern. He and Pericles met in private later that evening, long after the crowds had dissipated and the city's stone streets grew quiet under the night sky. "Pericles," Socrates began, his voice measured as always, "your victory at Delos has bought you time, but not security. Alcibiades grows bolder with every passing day. and the people seem to hang on his every word. I fear that your vision for Athens, one of wisdom, diplomacy, and justice, may be slowly slipping through your fingers. Pericles turned toward him, his face heavy with the weight of the situation. I know, Socrates. I see the same dangers you do, but I cannot allow Athens to be led by ambition alone. Alcibiades seeks power, and in doing so, he risks the very ideals that make the city great. Socrates nodded, his eyes never leaving Pericles' face. Ambition, unchecked by reason, always leads to ruin. But do not forget, my friend, that it is not only Alcibiades who can shape Athens' future. The people must choose, and it is their minds that will decide the city's fate, not the speeches or promises of any man. Pericles sighed, his eyes drawn to the flickering torchlight that illuminated the shadows of the Acropolis above. I have given them a vision of what Athens can be, a city of reason, art, and democracy. But what if the city no longer wants that vision? What if the hunger for power and glory has overtaken the ideals that once made Athens shine? Socrates stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. Then it is your duty to remind them of what they are losing. Do not let fear or uncertainty guide your hand. Lead them with the same wisdom that brought this city to greatness. Pericles' gaze remained fixed on the distant hills surrounding the city, his mind racing. Socrates' words were, as always, profound and piercing. But the road ahead was treacherous, and the enemies both within and outside the walls of Athens seemed to multiply with each passing day. Meanwhile, in the shadowed corners of Athens, a different game was being played, one that involved not just military strategies, but betrayal. Alcibiades, ever the ambitious leader, had begun to gather a coalition of his own supporters within the city. His charm, combined with his military victories, had made him immensely popular with the younger generation, as well as many of the wealthy and influential citizens who were hungry for power. Alcibiades had always been a master of manipulation, playing on the desires of those around him and bending them to his will. Now, with his fleet having returned victorious, he had set his sights on something far greater than military glory. He wanted Athens itself, its political system, its people, and its soul. One evening, Alcibiades called a private meeting with some of his most trusted allies, a group of influential Athenians, many of whom had begun to question Pericles' leadership. Among them was Cleon, an outspoken populist who had long harbored ambitions of his own. Gentlemen, Alcibiades began, his voice smooth and persuasive, Athens stands at a crossroads. We have seen the power of our enemies, both external and internal. Sparta and Persia threaten our very existence. But more than that, the old order is crumbling. Pericles, for all his wisdom, has become a prisoner of his ideals. It is time for change. Cleon leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. You mean to replace him, don't you? To seize power for yourself? Alcibiades smiled, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. Not just for myself, Cleon. For all of you? We need a new direction, one that embraces strength and power over philosophy and diplomacy. Athens needs a leader who will act decisively, not one who hesitates. I offer that leadership. There were murmurs around the room, a sense of unease, mixed with the excitement of those who saw in Alcibiades the promise of a new era. A few nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. But Alcibiades knew that it was not the quiet ones he needed. It was those who were willing to take risks, to challenge the status quo. And what of Pericles? One of the men asked, his voice tentative. Alcibiades' expression hardened. Pericles is too invested in preserving an Athens of the past, a vision of a peaceful Athens that no longer has a place in this world. He has grown too cautious, too old. Cleon nodded, eagerly. We need action, Alcibiades, a strong hand. and you're the one who can provide it. The conspirators agreed to move forward, slowly at first, building their power base within the city. Alcibiades knew that to win over the people, he would have to be both a warrior and a politician. He would need to play the game of Athens' democracy, convincing the citizens that he was the only man capable of leading them into a future of conquest and glory. But Pericles was no fool. He had already begun to sense the growing discontent within the city. The whispers of rebellion grew louder as Alcibiades' influence expanded, and the factions of Athens became more divided. Pericles knew that the challenge would not just be to face the Persian threat, it was to fight for the soul of Athens itself. As the weeks passed, Athens found itself slipping deeper into a state of political disarray. The factions continued to grow, and the city's democracy was more fragile than ever. Pericles, though still beloved by many, could no longer unite the people as he once had. Alcibiades, with his military genius and persuasive charisma, was gaining ground, and the question of who would ultimately lead Athens began to hang heavy in the air. One fateful evening, as the assembly convened to discuss Athens' next move, in the war against Persia, Pericles addressed the crowd one last time. His voice, though weary, was still filled with the conviction of a man who believed in the values of Athens more than anything else. "My fellow Athenians," Pericles began, his words carrying over the crowd, "the time has come for us to face our greatest trial. The enemies that surround us grow stronger with every day, but we must not lose sight of who we are. We are Athenians, a people of reason, of democracy, and of freedom. Let us not abandon these principles in the name of glory or conquest." The crowd was silent, but the tension was palpable. Pericles knew that this was the defining moment for Athens. Either they would embrace his vision, or they would fall under the sway of Alcibiades and his militaristic ambitions. And then a voice rang out from the crowd. Pericles is a man of the past. It was Alcibiades, stepping forward, his voice filled with energy and passion. He talks of ideals, but the world has changed. We need a new leader, one who will act decisively, not one who will lead us to ruin. The assembly erupted in chaos. The crowd was torn between the two men, one who represented the old Athens of intellect and reason, and the other who promised strength and action in a world that seemed increasingly dangerous. In that moment, the fate of Athens hung in the balance. The streets of Athens were abuzz with fervor as the assembly continued to break into factions. The contest for the city's soul was now a public spectacle. On one side stood Pericles, the philosopher king who had led Athens to greatness through wisdom and diplomacy. On the other, Alcibiades, the fiery general who promised a future of glory and military conquest. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and the city's future hung in the balance. The night following Alcibiades' outburst in the assembly, Athens seemed to hold its breath. The city's political landscape had shifted. Pericles, despite his long reign, was no longer the undisputed leader. Alcibiades, emboldened by his military success and his growing popularity among the youth, had made his move. But what began as a political debate quickly morphed into something more dangerous. A battle for control of the city-state itself. Pericles retreated to his private residence, his mind heavy with the weight of the choices that lay ahead. He had led Athens through its golden age, but now the people seemed restless. His ideals, his vision of a city built on democracy and reason, were at odds with the ambition and passion that Alcibiades represented. The young general's promise of power, prestige, and military glory was seductive to many, especially those who felt disillusioned by the slow pace of Athens' politics and wary of the growing threat from Sparta and Persia. In the quiet of his chamber, Pericles sat in solitude, staring out at the city below. He could hear the distant murmur of the agora, the ongoing debates between his supporters, and Alcibiades' followers. The war against Persia was far from won, and the situation with Sparta was only worsening. Athens was standing on the precipice of a monumental shift, and Pericles knew that the city was at a crossroads. He could not simply fight for his position, nor could he abandon his vision of Athens across the city. Alcibiades basked in the glow of his triumph. Word had spread quickly of his challenge to Pericles, and the response from the public was loud and clear. The people craved action, not words. The youth, the soldiers, the wealthy landowners, they all rallied to his banner. Alcibiades, in his mind, was not just fighting for the leadership of Athens. He was fighting for its future, one that he saw as an empire of might and glory. The following day, Alcibiades convened with his closest allies, including Cleon and other populist leaders, at a private villa just outside the city. His eyes sparkled with ambition, a gleam of certainty in his voice. "We will not be content to merely defend Athens. We will expand. We will dominate the seas and take what is ours. The Persians are weak. The Spartans are on the brink of collapse. We need only the courage to strike." Cleon, ever eager to seize power, nodded enthusiastically. "You have the support of the people, Alcibiades. The time for hesitation is over. The people want a leader who will act, not a man who talks about ideals." Alcibiades' gaze hardened as he looked at his fellow conspirators. "Then we strike. First, we will not wait for Sparta or Persia to come to us. We will lead Greece into a new era." As they discussed the details of their plans, Pericles, in his quiet retreat, pondered the words that Socrates had spoken to him so many times. The greatest strength of Athens lies in its ability to reason, to unite its people in pursuit of wisdom and justice. Yet now it seemed the people of Athens were no longer listening to reason. They were listening to the promises of glory, of conquest, and of power. A week later, Alcibiades took a dramatic step. He called for a vote in the assembly, one that would seek the people's approval for a bold new military campaign. The question was simple. Should Athens lead an attack on Persia's eastern territories to weaken their grip on the region and secure more resources for the city? The idea was wildly popular among those who had rallied to Alcibiades' cause, and they turned out in droves to support the proposal. The assembly hall was packed to the brim as Alcibiades rose to speak before the people. His voice, full of fire and conviction, rang out over the crowd. "Athens has grown complacent. We have sat idle while our enemies grow stronger. Our fleets lie dormant in the harbors, while Persia takes more territory and Sparta gains more strength. If we do not act now, we will lose everything. This is our moment, Athenians. We will strike at the heart of Persia, and we will return to Athens as conquerors. We will show the world that Athens is the greatest force in all of Greece." The crowd erupted in applause. The young general had them in the palm of his hand. His words were a promise of glory, of a future where Athens ruled the seas and the lands, a future where its enemies trembled before its might. Pericles watched from the back of the hall, his face somber. He knew that this was a pivotal moment in Athens' history. If Alcibiades succeeded in convincing the people, Athens would forever change. The city that had once been a beacon of democracy, and reason would transform into an empire, one of war, conquest, and ambition. It was a tempting vision, but one that he feared would destroy the very foundation of Athens. The vote was taken, and it was decisive. Alcibiades had won. The people, swept up by his vision of conquest, had chosen the path of military expansion. Pericles, the man who had built Athens into a beacon of intellectual and cultural achievement, found himself standing at the edge of political oblivion. That evening, Pericles met with his closest advisors, including Socrates, to discuss the outcome of the vote. The philosopher, ever the calm voice of reason, had watched the proceedings with growing concern. "They have chosen the path of power," Socrates said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But what of the soul of Athens? What of the city's ideals?" Pericles sank into a chair, the weight of his years pressing upon him. "I fear that we have lost our way, Socrates. The people want glory, they want power, and they no longer seem to care for the principles that made Athens great. I have tried to lead them by reason, but now I see that the thirst for power cannot be quenched with words." Socrates regarded him with sympathy. "It is not that the people are inherently wrong. Power, after all, is not evil. It is the pursuit of power without wisdom, without balance, that leads to ruin. If Athens embraces this new path, Pericles, it is your duty to remind them of what they stand to lose." Pericles looked out over the city, his gaze softening as he considered Socrates' words. "I have failed to show them that the true strength of Athens lies not in its armies, but in its ideals. But it is not too late. I will not abandon the city to Alcibiades and his vision. There is still time to fight for Athens, just not in the way they expect." The next day, Pericles took to the Agora once more, standing before the assembly with the quiet dignity that had long defined his leadership. His voice rang out, firm and clear. "Athens is at a crossroads. We stand on the edge of a new era, one that promises wealth and power. But power without reason is a hollow victory. The greatest minds of Athens built this city to be a place of enlightenment, of democracy, and of justice. To abandon that for the sake of conquest is to forsake the very soul of Athens." His words were met with a mixture of silence and murmurs from the crowd. Alcibiades, standing at the front of the hall, eyed him with disdain. "You speak of ideals, Pericles," Alcibiades retorted, stepping forward. "But ideals do not win. Wars. Do you really believe that Athens can survive if we do not expand? If we do not assert our strength? You cannot hold back the tide of history." Pericles met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps not, but I can remind Athens of its true power, its ability to inspire, to create, and to lead by example, not by force. If we lose that, we lose everything." For a moment, the assembly was silent, the weight of Pericles' words hanging in the air. But Alcibiades' supporters, emboldened by their victory in the vote, were quick to counter. The stage was set for an even greater struggle for Athens' future, for its very identity. The choice had been made. Athens would embark on its military campaign, led by Alcibiades. But the war that would follow would not just be one of swords and ships. It would be a war for the soul of Athens itself. The sounds of war were on the horizon, but it was not just the battle against Persia and Sparta that threatened Athens. It was the battle within. The city, once united under the banner of democracy and reason, now found itself fractured, divided, between the old guard of Pericles and the new wave of militaristic ambition championed by Alcibiades. As Athens set its sights on conquest, its ideals were slipping through its fingers, like sand through an open hand. Pericles had been defeated politically, but his mind still burned with the conviction of his ideals. He knew that if Athens was to truly survive, it needed more than just military power. It needed to remain true to the values that had made it great: democracy, wisdom, and art. But how could he convince the people now, when Alcibiades and his promises of glory had won? Their hearts? The streets of Athens were a sea of fervor. Banners waved, citizens filled the Agora, and the anticipation for the upcoming war filled the air. The assembly was once again convening, and Alcibiades was at the center of it all. His charm and charisma had drawn the people to his cause, and now he was a hero, a leader that seemed to embody everything Athens had once stood for: strength, courage, and the audacity to conquer. The speech Alcibiades delivered before the assembly was filled with fire and passion. his voice resonating with the very core of the Athenian spirit. "We stand on the brink of greatness," Alcibiades exclaimed, his words echoing through the marble pillars of the assembly hall. "This is our moment to show the world that Athens is not just a city of philosophers and poets, but a force to be reckoned with. We will conquer the Persian Empire. We will assert our strength, and we will forge a new Athens, one that commands respect across the seas." The crowd erupted into applause, the enthusiasm overwhelming. Young men and soldiers alike cheered, their eyes gleaming with the promise of glory. Alcibiades had succeeded in rallying the people to his cause. The promise of conquest, of riches and power, was far more appealing to the citizens than the quiet, intellectual appeal of Pericles. Pericles, standing at the back of the hall, observed in silence. The weight of the defeat bore heavily on him. His vision for Athens was slipping away, and the city was being drawn into a new era, one that seemed to promise prosperity, but at the cost of its very soul. As the city prepared for the campaign, the divisions within Athens grew deeper. While Alcibiades had captured the hearts of many, Pericles was not ready to surrender without a fight. He began to meet in secret with his most loyal supporters, old generals and former allies who still believed in Athens' ideals. "We cannot allow Alcibiades to lead us into the darkness of empire," Pericles said quietly as he addressed his group. "If we lose our principles, we will be no better than the empires we seek to conquer. The heart of Athens is democracy. The mind of Athens is wisdom. If we abandon that, we will no longer be Athens." His words were met with somber nods from the group, but the reality was harsh. The war was about to begin, and Athens had chosen its path. The reality of his vision seemed distant, even to those who still believed in him. War was coming, and war required more than ideals. It required power, strategy, and might. The campaign began with Alcibiades leading the charge. His ships set sail for Asia Minor, and Athens' fleets, now bolstered by reinforcements, moved swiftly through the Mediterranean. Alcibiades, always confident in his ability to lead, believed that victory would be swift. He was not a man to hesitate, not a man to wait for the approval of philosophers or statesmen. In his mind, the glory of Athens was earned through action, not deliberation. Yet as the campaign moved forward, the reality of war began to take its toll. The Persian forces were larger and more organized than Alcibiades had anticipated. The city-states of Greece, though still fragmented, had begun to unite against Athens' growing militarism. Even Sparta, despite its previous rivalries with Persia, had joined forces with the Eastern Empire in a calculated move to curb Athens' growing power. Alcibiades found himself fighting on multiple fronts, with the pressure of commanding not only the Athenian fleet, but also the fractured political alliances that had been hastily forged. His promises of a quick victory seemed to be slipping away. Back in Athens, Pericles watched with growing concern. The city's political climate was deteriorating, with Alcibiades' followers growing more fervent and his enemies growing more outspoken. Even in the heart of Athens, there were whispers of rebellion calls for the city to fully embrace the militaristic future that Alcibiades had promised. But Pericles refused to let go of his vision for Athens. While Alcibiades fought to expand the empire, Pericles fought to preserve the city's soul. He reached out to those who still believed in Athens' ideals, quietly gathering support for a counteroffensive, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Weeks passed, and the war raged on. Alcibiades' campaign had met with some initial successes, but it had come at a cost. The Persian forces were not as easily defeated as he had imagined. He had underestimated the strength of their defenses and the depth of their resources. His fleet had been caught in a battle off the coast of Ionia, and though they had emerged victorious, the losses were significant. Back in Athens, The political situation had become increasingly volatile. The assembly was divided, with more members turning against Pericles, accusing him of holding Athens back with his ideals. Alcibiades, with his military successes, had become the face of the new Athens, one that would lead the city into a new era of power and conquest. Pericles, ever the philosopher, took to the agora once more, his voice steady despite the growing opposition. He knew that his position was tenuous, but he also knew that Athens could not afford to lose sight of its values. He would fight, not with swords, but with words. "We are a city of reason," Pericles declared before the assembly, his voice resonating with the weight of his years. "We are a city of art, of thought, and of democracy. If we sacrifice these things for the sake of war, we sacrifice the very essence of what makes Athens great. We cannot become an empire. We must remain a beacon of light in a world that has forgotten how to think." But the words of the great philosopher fell on deaf ears. The people had already made their choice. Alcibiades' call to arms had taken hold of their hearts, and the march of war seemed inevitable. The war between Athens and Persia raged on, and the city found itself consumed by its own ambition. The ideals of democracy and wisdom were increasingly overshadowed by the thirst for power. Alcibiades' vision of conquest had taken root, and Pericles found himself increasingly isolated, his once strong influence within the city waning. Yet, even as the winds of change blew through the halls of Athens, Pericles held on to the belief that there was still time to remind the people of what they had lost. His struggle was no longer just against Persia or Sparta. It was a fight for the very soul of Athens. As the battle lines were drawn, it was clear that the true war for Athens was not being fought on the shores of Asia Minor or the plains of Greece. It was being fought within the hearts and minds of its people. And whether Athens would survive the storm or be consumed by the very power it sought to wield was a question that only time could answer. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Athens, a bitter reminder of the storm that was sweeping through the city. Athens, once the beacon of reason, democracy, and intellectual greatness, now stood at the edge of destruction, not from external enemies, but from within. The war with Persia was escalating, but it was the battle for the city's soul that was truly at stake. Pericles, the great leader who had brought Athens to its height, was now a man standing on the precipice of defeat. His vision for Athens, a city of wisdom and culture, seemed increasingly obsolete in the face of Alcibiades' aggressive military strategies and his promises of glory. The people, once proud of their democratic ideals, were now consumed with the desire for conquest. They had chosen Alcibiades' vision one of expansion, of strength, of an empire that would rival the Persian power itself. And yet Pericles refused to abandon his ideals, even as the tide of history swept away everything he had fought for. The once vibrant city, filled with artists, philosophers, and scholars, now found itself caught in the grip of ambition, torn between two visions, one that promised power and glory, and one that called for reason and introspection. The streets of Athens were filled with a restless energy. Alcibiades' supporters were everywhere, their voices raised in calls for war and expansion. The young general had taken command of the fleet once more, leaving Pericles behind, his influencing the assembly rapidly fading. The city was being reshaped, not by the minds of philosophers, but by the wills of men like Alcibiades, who sought to carve Athens into a mighty empire. Alcibiades, now the hero of Athens, returned from his campaigns with new triumphs. He had pushed deeper into Persia's territories, and his victories were lauded by the people. His charisma, his confidence, and his ability to inspire the masses made him a hero in the eyes of the people, while Pericles, who had warned against unchecked ambition, was seen as an obstacle, a relic of a bygone era. In the halls of the assembly, Alcibiades rose to speak, his voice booming across the room. "Athens is not a city for philosophers and dreamers," he declared, his tone full of fire. "We are a city of warriors, of conquerors. We must take what is ours by force. Our enemies trembled before our might. It is time to secure our place in history as the greatest empire the world has ever known." The crowd roared with approval. The soldiers, the youth, the wealthy families who had long sought power, these were Alcibiades' true supporters. They saw in him the future of Athens, a future that promised wealth, power, and an unchallenged place in the world. Pericles, who had once stood at the front of the assembly, now sat quietly in the back. His age seemed to weigh more heavily on him with each passing day, but it was not just the years that burdened him. It was the realization that his city, his Athens, was slipping away. His dreams of a peaceful, thoughtful Athens, one that led through wisdom and culture, were slipping through his fingers. Pericles, despite his political defeat, refused to leave the city. He retired to his private quarters, but he was not idle. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by scrolls and records of Athens' past, he began to work on his final plea to the city he loved so dearly. It would be a speech unlike any he had ever given, a call to arms not with swords, but with words. As he wrote, his thoughts turned to the future of Athens and the fate of its people. "What have we become?" He wrote in his journal. "Are we to be nothing more than an empire, a conqueror of lands, like the Persians we once despised? Or are we to remain true to our ideals, to the principles that made us great in the first place?" It was not just the external threat that haunted Pericles. It was the thought that Athens might become a shadow of itself, a city built on power and conquest rather than wisdom and art. He began to draft his speech, carefully crafting each word, knowing that it might be his final attempt to save the soul of Athens. The day of the speech arrived, and Pericles stood before the assembly once more. His body was weary, but his voice remained strong. The assembly hall was filled to capacity, and the people, many of them loyal to Alcibiades, waited to hear what the old leader would say. Alcibiades, standing at the front, smirked, confident that his supporters would drown out any opposition. But Pericles was undeterred. With quiet dignity, he began. "Athens," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I stand before you not as a general, not as a man of arms, but as a man of ideas. And it is ideas, not weapons, that have made this city great. We are the cradle of democracy, of philosophy, of culture. We are the city that gave birth to Socrates, to Plato, to the arts that have shaped the world." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. The assembly was silent, waiting for him to continue. "But we stand on the brink of a great and terrible choice. We have tasted victory in war, and now we are tempted by the siren call of conquest. Alcibiades promises us power, but at what cost? What are we becoming if we abandon the ideals that made us who we are? We will conquer the world, yes, but we will lose our very soul in the process." There was a murmur among the crowd. Some of Alcibiades' supporters shifted uncomfortably, but Pericles pressed on. "We must ask ourselves, what is Athens? Are we a people of reason, of justice, and of beauty? Or are we to become another empire, driven by ambition and the desire for glory? Power will not make us great. It is our ideas, our ability to reason, our commitment to democracy that has made us the envy of the world." For the first time in years, Pericles' words seemed to resonate with the crowd. Some of the older members of the assembly, those who remembered the Athens of Pericles' early days, nodded in agreement. But Alcibiades, sensing that the tide might turn, stepped forward. "Enough, Pericles," he shouted. "You speak of ideals, but ideals alone will not defend Athens from its enemies. You talk of wisdom, but wisdom does not win battles. It is power that secures our future. The assembly erupted into chaos. Alcibiades' supporters shouted in anger, while Pericles' few remaining allies tried to calm the room. The voices of the people were divided, one side calling for empire, the other for reason. And in the middle of it all, Pericles stood, steadfast in his belief that Athens' soul was worth saving, even if it meant standing alone. The next few weeks were marked by political instability. Alcibiades, with his military victories and newfound popularity, began to move against Pericles. The assembly, now firmly in Alcibiades' control, began to strip Pericles of his influence. It was clear that the philosopher king's time had passed. The city was now moving in a new direction, one that would define Athens for generations to come. Pericles, knowing that he could no longer change the course of the city, withdrew from public life. But his spirit and the memory of his leadership would linger in Athens long after he was gone. His vision for a city of reason and wisdom was fading, but it was not forgotten. The battle for Athens' soul had been lost, but the legacy of Pericles would echo in the minds of future generations. His ideals, though defeated, were not entirely erased. Athens, once a city of philosophers, artists, and statesmen, had now turned its gaze toward the future, a future of conquest and military might. Under the leadership of Alcibiades, the city-state had shaken off the last remnants of its intellectual past, embracing a new era of power. The streets that had once echoed with the voices of great thinkers now rang with the march of soldiers and the clang of armor. The people of Athens, once content to sit in the agora and debate, now followed Alcibiades with the fervor of a people drunk on the promise of empire. In the assembly, Alcibiades spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his vision of Athens. Future was inevitable. His words were powerful, persuasive, and full of the promise of glory. To the citizens of Athens, war had become not just a necessity, but a pathway to greatness. He painted vivid pictures of an Athens that would stand as the beacon of Greek civilization, a city that would not only rule the seas, but also expand its borders across Asia and the Mediterranean. A time of passive defense is over, Alcibiades declared in one of his speeches, his voice booming through the marble halls of the assembly. We have conquered the seas, and now it is time to claim the land. Our enemies tremble, and they will tremble even more when we expand our empire. We will bring the wisdom of Athens to every corner of the known world. The assembly cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of approval. Alcibiades had become the undisputed leader of Athens, and under his leadership, the city began its march toward empire. He wasted no time in organizing military expeditions against Persia, the Peloponnesian League, and even other Greek city-states that dared to oppose his vision. But in the shadow of this rapid expansion, there were murmurs of dissent. Among the older citizens and those who had once followed Pericles, there was a growing sense of unease. The ideals of democracy, justice, and wisdom seemed increasingly irrelevant as Athens marched to war. The very principles that had made Athens great, the idea of self-rule, the belief in the power of intellect, were being cast aside in favor of military conquest. Alcibiades' first great military campaign was launched against the Persian Empire. His fleet, bolstered by the might of Athens' naval power, set sail toward the eastern coast. He sought to secure more territory, extending Athens' influence across Asia Minor and the Aegean Sea. The cities of the Greek islands, which had once been under the protection of Athens, now found themselves swept into Alcibiades' vision of empire. The war was brutal, and the stakes were high. Persia, though weakened by years of internal strife, was still a formidable force. The Persian navy, though not as advanced as Athens, was large and well-funded. Alcibiades, however, believed in his strategy. He knew that the key to victory lay not just in force, but in diplomacy. He He sought to forge alliances with smaller city-states, promising them protection in exchange for loyalty to Athens. The first engagement was off the coast of Ionia, a small, strategic port city that had long been a prize for Athens and Persia. Alike, Alcibiades' fleet arrived swiftly, catching the Persian defenders off guard. The battle was fierce, the waters churning with the violence of war. But in the end, Alcibiades' ships triumphed, the Persian fleet retreating in disarray. The people of Athens celebrated their victory, their spirits lifted by the promise of more. Alcibiades returned to Athens a hero, hailed as the man who had led the city to greatness once again. He offered grand celebrations in the city, parades through the Agora, and offerings to the gods. The crowds, drunk on the sweet taste of victory, cheered his name. But there was a growing sense of unease among those who had once believed in the vision of Pericles. The philosopher king's dream of a democratic Athens, a city of reason and beauty, was slipping away. In its place was a new Athens, one driven by ambition and the lust for power. The soldiers who marched through the streets no longer carried the ideals of Athens' democracy. They carried the banners of empire. Back in the halls of power, Pericles' old allies began to speak out against Alcibiades' growing influence. Men like Themistocles, who had once stood by Pericles' side, now found themselves at odds with the new order. They feared that Alcibiades' imperial ambitions would lead Athens into ruin, that the city's soul would be lost forever in the pursuit of power. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Themistocles gathered with a small group of dissidents in a quiet corner of the Agora. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that the walls of Athens were listening. "We are losing Athens," Themistocles said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "What we fought for, what we built, is slipping through our hands. Alcibiades will lead us to the same fate as those empires we once fought against. He seeks power, not wisdom. He will drag us into wars we cannot win. But he is the hero of Athens." One of the younger men replied, his voice filled with fervor. "He has brought us victory. We control the seas. We are mighty. The glory of conquest is fleeting," Themistocles said. "Once we turn our backs on our ideals, we will lose everything. We will become no different than the empires we despise. Athens is not just a city, it is an idea. We must preserve that idea, or we will cease to exist as anything more than another conquering force." But it was too late for words. Alcibiades had won the people's hearts, and Athens was marching toward an uncertain future. Those who still held to the vision of Pericles were now powerless to stop the tide of change. The decision had been made, and Athens was moving toward a new era, one that would be defined by conquest, ambition, and military strength. As Alcibiades' empire expanded, so did the enemies of Athens. The other Greek city-states, long jealous of Athens' power, began to rally against it. Sparta, always a thorn in Athens' side, saw an opportunity to strike. The Peloponnesian League, united under Sparta's banner, began to gather forces. Persia, once an enemy, had now become estranged. Ally one that, under the right circumstances, could tip the balance of power in their favor. Athens, caught in a web of alliances and hostilities, prepared for what would be its greatest war. The island cities, now under Athens' control, began to chafe under Alcibiades' rule, feeling the weight of Athenian imperialism. And at the heart of it all stood Alcibiades, confident in his vision, but unaware of the growing dangers that lay ahead. In the quiet corners of Athens, Pericles' legacy lingered like a shadow. He had once spoken of a city ruled by wisdom and reason, where the pursuit of knowledge and art was the highest calling. But now, as the drums of war echoed through the streets, those ideals seemed distant. The Athens that Pericles had dreamed of was no more. In its place was a city that would either rise to become the greatest empire the world had ever seen, or fall into the same ruin as the empires it sought to conquer. The tension between the old Athens and the new Athens was palpable. Could Athens hold on to its soul in the face of its newfound power? Or would it be consumed by the very ambition it had once condemned? The drums of war echoed through Athens, growing louder with each passing day. The streets, once filled with the vibrant discussions of scholars and the lively debates of philosophers, now carried the heavy footsteps of soldiers, their armor clanking. As they marched toward the ships, Alcibiades had transformed Athens into a military powerhouse. But with this newfound strength came a growing cost, one that would soon be felt by all. The expansion of Athens' empire was relentless. Alcibiades' victories had granted him unprecedented power, and his ambitions had no bounds. The Athenian fleet, now the most formidable in the Mediterranean, sailed into foreign waters with ease, conquering city after city, laying claim to territory that had once been held by rivals. The islands, long under Athens' protection, now fell, fully under its rule. The cities of Asia Minor, seeing the tide turn in favor of Athens, quickly fell into line, pledging loyalty to Alcibiades. But as Athens' empire expanded, so did its enemies. The balance of power in Greece was shifting. Sparta, ever the rival to Athens, had grown tired of watching the city-state gain more and more influence. The Peloponnesian League, still reeling from the tension that had existed between Athens and Sparta, began to unite against their former enemies. Sparta's general Lysander began to rally the city-states under its banner, his eyes set firmly on breaking Athens' naval dominance. Meanwhile, Persia, once an ally of Athens against Sparta, began to grow suspicious of Athens' power. The Eastern Empire, though large and powerful, feared the rise of a city-state that could challenge its reach. Though Alcibiades had once charmed the Persian court, his growing ambition now put him at odds with the empire. The Persians, sensing a threat, began to pull back their support, leaving Athens vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. Back in Athens, the people, once enamored by Alcibiades' victories, began to feel the strain. The city, though rich from its conquests, now found itself caught in a web of political intrigue, divided between those who supported the idea of empire and those who longed for the days of peace and democracy. The democratic ideals that Pericles had championed were slipping further away, replaced by the militaristic policies of Alcibiades and his supporters. Pericles, though no longer a leader of the city, remained a presence that could not be ignored. His voice, though weakened by time and political defeat, still resonated with a few of Athens' most trusted citizens. The old philosopher king had warned of the dangers of ambition, of the consequences of Athens seeking to dominate the world rather than lead through reason and culture. Now, as Athens teetered on the edge of a full-scale war, his warnings had never seemed more prescient. In private meetings with his remaining supporters, Pericles spoke with quiet urgency. "We have come to a precipice," he said one evening, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "Alcibiades' path leads only to ruin. The empire he seeks to build will not bring us glory. It will bring us destruction. We have forgotten who we are. We are Athenians, not conquerors, but the builders of a city that stands for reason, democracy, and wisdom." His supporters, a dwindling group of the older generation, nodded solemnly, knowing that Pericles' vision for Athens was now a dying dream. But they also knew that the city had already moved too far down the path of imperialism to turn back. The tipping point came when Alcibiades, driven by his insatiable ambition, made a bold and reckless move. Seeking to cement Athens' dominance over the Aegean Sea, he set his sights on the powerful city-state of Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily. The city was a rival to Athens, and its wealth and resources were a tempting prize for an empire. that had grown hungry for more. Despite warnings from his advisors and generals, Alcibiades pushed forward with the plan. He believed that defeating Syracuse would send a clear message to both Sparta and Persia that Athens was the true power of the Mediterranean. The campaign was grand in scope, a show of strength that was meant to secure Athens' place as the supreme empire. But Alcibiades had underestimated his enemies. The Syracusans, though smaller in number, were fierce in their defense of their city. They had been prepared for war, and they quickly fortified their defenses. When the Athenian fleet arrived on the shores of Syracuse, they were met with a determined resistance. The battle for control of the city became a brutal and protracted siege. Days turned into weeks, and the Athenians, despite their superior fleet, found themselves trapped in a war they had not fully prepared for. The Syracusans fought fiercely, and the Athenians, worn down by the harsh conditions of the siege, began to suffer heavy losses. The once mighty fleet of Athens was decimated, and the soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to question the wisdom of their campaign. Alcibiades, realizing that his grand vision was crumbling, was forced to retreat. The once heroic general returned to Athens in disgrace, his reputation tarnished by the failure in Syracuse. The cost of the campaign had been staggering, not only in terms of lost men and ships, but in the erosion of Athens' power and prestige. Back in Athens, the news of the failed campaign hit like a thunderclap. The city, which had once been on the brink of empire, now found itself facing the consequences of its overreach. Alcibiades, once hailed as the future of Athens, was now a pariah. His failure in Syracuse had shattered his image as the savior of Athens, and many began to question whether the pursuit of empire was worth the cost. The political landscape of Athens began to shift again. The people, tired of the endless war, and the broken promises of glory, began to turn against the military leaders who had led them into this quagmire. Alcibiades was recalled to face trial, and though he would eventually escape punishment through his political cunning, his influence had been irreparably damaged. But the damage to Athens was far more profound. The city had overextended itself, losing not only the material cost of the war, but also the moral high ground it had once held. The democratic ideals that had made Athens the envy of the world were now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh realities of empire and conquest. The tensions between the aristocracy and the common people grew, as those who had benefited from the empire's expansion clashed with those who had lost in the campaign. In the wake of the failed campaign and the growing political unrest, Pericles' legacy began to gain a new life. His vision for Athens, though all but extinguished during his lifetime, began to be remembered with increasing reverence. As Athens struggled to reclaim its place in the world, many began to ask whether the path of empire had been worth it. One evening, as the city gathered for emergency assembly, a speaker rose to honor the memory of Pericles. Let us remember a man who led Athens to its golden age, not through conquest, but through wisdom, the speaker said, his voice filled with emotion. Pericles showed us that Athens' true power lies not in the sword, but in the hearts and minds of its people. Let us return to the ideals that made this city great. The assembly fell silent, and for the first time in years, the people began to reflect on the ideals that had once made Athens a beacon of light in the world. The question now was not whether Athens could regain its military might, but whether it could return to its roots, its vision of democracy, philosophy, and reason. The light of Athens, once a beacon of intellectual enlightenment and philosophical discourse, now flickered in the dim shadows of its imperial ambitions. The defeat at Syracuse had left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the city. The once immense fleet lay in ruin, its proud ships scattered across the Aegean Sea, a grim reminder of Athens' overreach. Alcibiades, once seen as the future of Athens, was now a broken man, discredited by his failure and unable to restore the city's fortunes. The political turmoil that followed was inevitable. Athens, like a mighty ship without a captain, drifted in uncertainty. The assembly, divided by bitter factions, struggled to find direction. The democratic ideals that had once united the city were now nothing more than distant echoes, drowned out by the hunger for power, conquest, and military glory. The tension between the supporters of Alcibiades and those who longed for a return to the vision of Pericles reached a breaking point. The failures of the military were felt most sharply by the common people, the farmers, artisans, and laborers who had paid the ultimate price for Athens' imperial dreams. They had watched their sons and brothers march off to war, only to return, broken, maimed, or never to return at all. Their city, once a symbol of democracy and prosperity, had become an empire driven by a few ambitious men and an insatiable desire for dominance. The promise of wealth and power seemed hollow now, as Athens' imperial dreams crumbled before them. The once vibrant agora now felt empty, as the citizens gathered not in debate, but in mourning. The marketplace, where traders from all over Greece once brought their wares, now felt more like a graveyard for Athens' ideals. Those who remembered the golden age of Pericles, when Athens was a city of reason, philosophy, and culture, now watched helplessly as the city plunged deeper into the abyss of militarism. Pericles, though long past his time, remained a figure of quiet significance for many who had once followed his leadership. His death had left a void in Athens, one that no leader, not even Alcibiades, could fill. Now, as the city teetered on the edge of collapse, his legacy became a touchstone for those who still believed that Athens could be more than a conqueror. In the midst of the political chaos, a group of intellectuals and philosophers, some old allies of Pericles, gathered, secretly to discuss the fate of the city. Among them were a handful of Pericles' former advisors, as well as Socrates, who had long warned that the pursuit of power without reason would destroy Athens. "We have lost our way," Socrates said to the group, his voice heavy with grief. "Athens, once the heart of wisdom and justice, now chases the same empty glory as the empires we once opposed. We have become what we despised, an empire driven by ambition and the desire to dominate. We must find a way to restore Athens to what it was," one of the philosophers, Anaxagoras, said quietly. Pericles understood that our power lay not in conquest, but in our ability to think, to create, and to govern justly. But now it seems we are too far gone. The city is consumed by its military victories, and the people no longer understand what made us great. Socrates sighed, his eyes distant. "I fear that Athens is lost to us. The people no longer seek wisdom, they seek power. And once the thirst for power is unleashed, there is little that can stop it. We cannot turn back the tide. The war has already begun, and with it, the death of Athens as we knew it." But one of the younger philosophers, a man named Alcibiades, no relation to the general, spoke up. "Perhaps it is not too late. Perhaps there is still time to remind the people of what they have lost. We must not give up on Athens. If we cannot restore the democracy that Pericles built, we must at least show the people that there is a better way. We cannot let the empire destroy the city's soul." Socrates looked at the young man, his gaze both sad and hopeful. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "But the people must see that the true power of Athens lies not in its military might, but in its wisdom, its culture, and its democracy. If they cannot understand that, then the price of empire will have been paid in full." As the people of Athens grew restless, the war with Persia escalated. The Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, began to consolidate its forces, preparing for a final confrontation with Athens. The great battle for supremacy in Greece loomed, and it was clear that Athens' imperial ambitions would be put to the ultimate test. In the midst of these mounting pressures, Alcibiades returned to Athens, hoping to regain some semblance of his former glory. The assembly, still divided but desperate for leadership, reluctantly allowed him to take command once again. His reputation, though tarnished, still held sway over the city's more militant factions. But Alcibiades, ever ambitious, had changed. The defeat at Syracuse had humbled him, and the failure of his imperial ambitions had made him reconsider the path he had set Athens on. Though he would continue to fight for Athens' military supremacy, a part of him began to understand the true cost of empire. One evening, as Alcibiades sat in a quiet corner of the agora, speaking with some of his former allies, he reflected on the choices that had led Athens to this point. "I once thought that the greatness of Athens lay in our power to conquer," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But now, I see that the true greatness of Athens lay in its ability to inspire not through force, but through wisdom, art, and democracy." Alcibiades had come to realize that the price of empire was not just measured in the lives lost on the battlefield, but in the erosion of Athens' soul. But could he, even now, return to the ideals that Pericles had championed? Could he, the very man who had driven Athens to the brink of empire, help restore its soul before it was too late? The fateful day arrived when Athens faced its greatest test yet. The combined forces of Sparta and Persia, united in their desire to crush Athens once and for all, prepared to strike. The Athenian fleet, though weakened by years of war, stood ready. Alcibiades, though no longer the confident conqueror he once was, commanded his fleet with a sense of purpose. This battle, he knew, would determine the future of Athens. As the battle raged on the waters near Aegospotami, the fate of Athens seemed to hang by a thread. The Persians and Spartans fought with ruthless precision, their forces overwhelming the weakened Athenian fleet. Though Alcibiades fought valiantly, it was clear that Athens could not withstand the combined might of its enemies. The Athenian fleet, once the pride of the city, was destroyed. The city itself was left vulnerable, and Athens, after years of glory and decline, finally fell from its position of power. In the aftermath of the great battle, Athens lay in ruin. Its empire had crumbled, its ideals lost in the pursuit of power. But even in the face of this tragedy, there remained a flicker of hope. The philosophers, the scholars, and the wise men who had once flourished in the city turned their eyes to the future. Athens would rebuild not as an empire, but as a city of reason, wisdom, and democracy once again. Pericles' legacy, though nearly extinguished in the flames of ambition, would never be forgotten. His ideals, though lost to the fires of war, would be passed on to future generations, who would one day look back on the lessons of Athens' rise and fall and strive to build a city worthy of its past. And so, Athens began again, not as an empire, but as the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and reason. The price of empire had been steep, but from its ashes, the spirit of Athens would rise once more. The fall of Athens marked the end of an era. The city that had once been the envy of the ancient world, the beacon of democracy, reason, and cultural achievement, lay in ruin. Its empire, built on military conquest, had crumbled beneath the weight of its own ambition. The battle at Aegospotami had shattered Athens' naval dominance, and its imperial dreams lay scattered across the Mediterranean like broken shards of a once great civilization. But Athens was not a city to remain in the ashes forever. Even in its darkest hour, the spirit of Athens, the ideals that had made it great, burned like a flickering flame. The philosophers, the scholars, and the intellectuals who had once filled the streets with their debates and ideas now found themselves called to a new purpose: to rebuild Athens, not as an empire, but as a city of wisdom, democracy, and culture. Once again, in the aftermath of the great defeat, a new generation of leaders began to emerge. They were not generals or conquerors, but men and women who had seen the cost of war and understood that the true power of Athens lay not in its armies, but in its ability to reason, create, and govern justly. Socrates, though no longer the young philosopher he had once been, emerged as a guiding figure in the rebuilding of Athens. His voice, though weary, was filled with the wisdom of years spent watching Athens rise and fall. He had warned the city about the dangers of unchecked ambition, and now, with Athens lying in ruin, his words had never seemed more poignant. At a gathering of scholars and statesmen, Socrates addressed a group of citizens who had come together to discuss the future of the city. "Athens has lost its way," he said, his voice steady yet filled with sorrow. "But it is not too late. We have learned the price of empire, and now it is time for us to return to the principles that made Athens great. It is time for us to rebuild not an empire, but a city where wisdom, justice, and democracy guide our decisions." His words resonated deeply with those in the room. They knew the path forward would not be easy. Athens had been battered by war, its people divided and broken. But Socrates' vision of a city rebuilt on ideals was a spark of hope. Athens could rise again, but it would require patience, sacrifice, and a return to the principles that had once made it the shining city of the ancient world. The rebuilding of Athens was a slow and painstaking process. The city, though damaged, was not beyond repair. The Agora, once the heart of the city where citizens gathered to discuss politics, philosophy, and art, began to come alive again. Slowly but surely, scholars, artists, and thinkers returned to Athens, determined to restore the city's legacy as the birthplace of democracy and intellectual achievement. The assembly, which had once been filled with heated debates over war and conquest, now focused on rebuilding the city's political structure. The leaders who emerged in the wake of Athens' fall understood that the city's future would depend on its commitment to democracy. They worked to restore the ideals of self-governance, participation, and justice that had once defined Athens. One of the key figures in the rebirth of Athens was Cleon, a former populist leader who had once supported Alcibiades' militaristic vision. After the fall of Athens, Cleon experienced a profound transformation. Witnessing the devastation caused by Athens' empire, he came to believe that the city's future lay not in military conquest, but in its intellectual and democratic legacy. He became one of the strongest advocates for the rebuilding of Athens as a city of ideas, focusing on the restoration of the people's power to govern themselves. Cleon, once a divisive figure in Athenian politics, now worked alongside Socrates and other reformers to re-establish a government that would empower the people. The democratic structures that had been weakened during the years of war and empire were carefully restored, and Athens slowly began to regain its political stability. The cultural and intellectual renaissance that followed the rebuilding of Athens was nothing short of remarkable. Artists, playwrights, and philosophers flocked to the city, eager to contribute to its revival. In the theaters, the plays of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus were performed once more, stirring the hearts of the people with stories of heroism, tragedy, and moral choice. The works of these playwrights, many of which had been written during Athens' golden age, became symbols of the city's renewed commitment to the power of art and ideas. The philosophers, led by Socrates, began to re-establish Athens as the center of intellectual thought. Young men and women, drawn from across Greece, traveled to the city to study under the great thinkers of the day. Socrates himself, though, growing older, continued to teach his followers about the importance of wisdom, self-examination, and moral virtue. His teachings inspired a new generation of leaders who would carry the torch of Athens' intellectual heritage into the future. Despite the slow but steady progress, the road to recovery was fraught with challenges. Athens had lost much its empire, its wealth, and its pride. The scars of war ran deep, and many of its citizens had lost faith in the city's ability to return to its former glory. The memories of the wars fought, the lives lost, and the promises of glory that had led them astray still haunted the city's collective consciousness. But as the years passed, Athens began to find a new sense of purpose. The city's philosophers and leaders worked tirelessly to remind the people of what they had once achieved and what they could still become. Slowly, Athens began to regain its confidence, not through military might, but through the strength of its ideas. One of the greatest accomplishments of this new Athens was the establishment of the Academy of Athens, a place where philosophers, scientists, and scholars could come together to exchange ideas and explore the mysteries of the world. The Academy, founded by Plato, a student of Socrates, would go on to become one of the most important institutions in the ancient world, shaping the future of Western philosophy for centuries to come. The establishment of the Academy was a symbol of Athens' renewed commitment to intellectual and cultural achievement. It was a place where ideas could flourish, free from the influence of empire and conquest. And it was a place where the principles of democracy and reason could once again take root. As Athens rebuilt itself, Pericles' legacy was remembered and honored. His vision for the city, though nearly lost in the pursuit of empire, had not been entirely extinguished. His ideals of democracy, wisdom, and the pursuit of knowledge became the guiding light for the new Athens. In the quiet moments of reflection, the people of Athens looked back on the mistakes of the past. They had been tempted by the promise of power and glory, but they had learned that the true strength of Athens lay not in its military might, but in its ability to think, create, and govern justly. The price of empire had been steep, but from its ashes, Athens had emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to the ideals that had once made it the greatest city in the ancient world. The story of Athens is one of rise and fall, of greatness and ruin. It is a story that has echoed through the centuries, inspiring generations of thinkers, leaders, and citizens. From the heights of its empire to the depths of its decline, Athens has shown the world that true power does not lie in the sword, but in the wisdom of the people and the strength of ideas. Though the empire of Athens is no more, the legacy of its democracy, its philosophy, and its art continues to shape the world. The ideas that were born in Athens, ideas of reason, justice, and self-governance, have endured, influencing the course of history and inspiring the future of humanity. And so, the spirit of Athens lives on not in the conquest of lands, but in the enduring power of ideas that continue to light the path for all who seek truth, wisdom, and justice. The rebirth of Athens is a testament to the resilience of a city that, in its darkest hour, found its way back to the ideals that had once made it the jewel of the ancient world. The story of Athens is one of brilliance, ambition, fall, and rebirth. It is a story that spans centuries, where the rise and decline of a city-state mirror the eternal struggle between power and wisdom, between conquest and ideals. Though Athens once sought to expand its empire through military might, it was the ideals of democracy, reason, and intellectual achievement that ultimately defined its legacy. From the time of Pericles, Athens stood as a beacon of intellectual and artistic excellence. It gave birth to some of the greatest minds in history, from Socrates and Plato to Aristotle, whose ideas would shape the philosophical and political landscape of the Western world for generations. Athens taught the world that true power lay, not in domination, but in the pursuit of knowledge, justice, and the common good. Yet, as the winds of ambition swept through its streets, Athens succumbed to the temptation of empire. The leadership of Alcibiades, though filled with military prowess, led Athens down a path of conquest that ultimately fractured its soul. The desire for glory, unchecked by reason, brought about its downfall. the defeat in the Battle of Syracuse, and the eventual loss of its fleet were symbolic of Athens' internal collapse, where the very ideals that once made it great were overshadowed by the lust for power. But Athens' story did not end in ruin. As the city lay broken, the spirit of its past, its commitment to democracy, wisdom, and cultural achievement survived. The philosophers and intellectuals who had once thrived in its agora returned to rebuild, not the empire, but the mind of Athens. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle carried forward the legacy of thought, ensuring that the ideas of Athens would endure. Rome, which inherited much of Athens' intellectual legacy, would rise to dominate the known world, but it would always carry within it the echoes of Athens' greatness. The Empire of Rome, while driven by military might, would be shaped by the ideas of Greece. The works of Greek philosophers would find their place in Roman schools and courts, and the Roman Republic would be influenced by Athenian democratic ideals. Through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and beyond, the legacy of Athens lived on. The principles that Pericles had championed, the belief in reason, justice, and the potential for human greatness, continued to shape the course of history. Athens' fall was a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, but its resurrection as a symbol of intellectual freedom was an enduring triumph. Today, the story of Athens is not just a historical tale, but a living legacy. Its ideals continue to inspire the world, from the halls of government to the classrooms of academia. The pursuit of knowledge, the power of democracy, and the potential of human reason remain as relevant now as they were when Athens first rose to greatness. Athens, the cradle of philosophy, the birthplace of democracy, and the city of art and intellect, may no longer rule the seas, but its light continues to guide us. The empire that Athens built was not one of armies or conquests, but one of ideas that have shaped the modern world and continue to shape the future. In the end, the story of Athens is not one of empire or war, but of the eternal pursuit of wisdom, justice, and the common good. And as long as humanity seeks knowledge, as long as we strive to understand ourselves and the world around us, the spirit of Athens will live on an undying flame that burns in the hearts and minds of all those who dare to dream, to think, and to act with reason.